Okay, here's where I look into my crystal ball and predict the future. Then later, we can all laugh at how wrong I was. But for real, if you're lost and trying to find your way, even a blurry map is better than no map at all. There are a handful of global trends that represent immense obstacles as we try to chart a safe course to the future. By the way, you can find a list of topics I'll be covering in this video in the description below, in case you want to know where I'm going with all this. I know I can be a bit long-winded in my storytelling. The short list of important global trends is climate change, mass extinction, environmental toxification, and resource depletion. If that wasn't enough foreshadowing, the subject matter of the next couple videos is going to get very heavy. It's not that I enjoy dwelling on the dark stuff, it's just that if you're running fast through an obstacle course, it's pretty important to have your eyes open. Otherwise, you're almost guaranteed to get taken out by an obstacle. There's one underlying trend that's driving all these other trends. It's a key piece of the puzzle that most people seem to be missing in their conceptual maps of the future. So in this video, I'll try to explain this missing piece of the puzzle so that we can understand the present within historical context and calibrate our expectations for the future. But first, story time. One time, me and some friends got the bright idea to go chop down a tree for firewood, except we didn't have a chainsaw handy at the moment. So we decided to try chopping it down by hand. Hi-ya! Hi-ya! We did find an axe in the garage, but it wasn't even a full-sized axe. It was just a little hatchet. So we walked into the woods like a bunch of fools and found a dead standing ash tree to chop down. We took turns whacking it over and over for what seemed like an hour. We did eventually succeed in chopping it down, but it felt like we expended more energy in the chopping than whatever energy we would have actually gotten out of the wood for heating. This is one of the moments that made me really appreciate how we have tools that can harness and transport concentrated forms of energy like electricity and gas to do enormous amounts of work for us. Energy is simply the ability to do work. Grinding corn to make Doritos, boiling water for ramen noodles, pushing cars uphill, melting sand to make glass, and so on. All this requires energy, and that energy has costs. Not just financial costs, but social and environmental costs as well. The key to understand why there are no simple, easy solutions to these converging global trends is to understand how energy is literally the fuel that the engine of modern civilization runs on. Just about all goods and services we produce and consume are dependent on this energy. For instance, it takes about 10 calories of fossil fuel energy in order to produce 1 calorie of food energy using modern agricultural practices. The modern way of life that most of us are living or aspiring towards requires a shocking amount of energy once you really wrap your head around it. Have you ever run out of gas and had to push your car to the side of the road? It's a lot of work to move that heavy hunk of metal, right? Now imagine pushing it for 30 miles, including up and down hills. Even if you have some friends to help, that would take a ton of time and effort. And yet, we can have all that work done for us by 1 gallon of gasoline that we might pay $5 for and complain that it's too expensive. Imagine what you'd have to pay someone to push your car that distance. My friends, the energy in 1 gallon of gasoline is an extremely cheap way to get work done for us. If we replaced current energy sources with humans pedaling stationary bicycles, the average North American would require 200 full-time bikers generating the energy to sustain their lifestyle. That's the amount of energy keeping your house warm in the winter, cool in the summer, keeping the lights on and the fridge running, transporting you around the city as you run errands, the energy to build and maintain the buildings and roads and infrastructure you rely on, the energy to extract and process the materials in the products you buy. This is why I say that our daily decisions are highly leveraged because of this invisible workforce of cheap energy at our beck and call. And almost 90% of this energy comes from fossil fuels. Our high energy way of life feels normal to us. But really, this period is a brief historical anomaly. For 95% of human history, the average person used something like 100 times less, or 1% net energy per person compared to current use. Instead of nuclear power, they had donkey power. But with the discovery of fossil fuels in the late 1800s, there was a rapid acceleration in energy consumption. Today, global demand for energy continues to grow rapidly and is greatly outpacing discoveries of new fossil fuel deposits. We're not finding enough energy sources fast enough to keep up with what we're using. When oil was first discovered, there were tons of large, easy-to-access deposits where you could basically stick a big metal straw in the ground and suck out pure, sweet crude oil. But over time, these large, pure, and accessible deposits have been depleted, leaving the industry to chase after smaller, hard-to-access, and lower-quality sources. Often, those poorer-quality deposits require riskier and more destructive extraction methods, like mountaintop removal for coal, deep ocean oil drilling, and the vast boreal forests of Canada being cleared for tar sands extraction. Instead of the straw in the ground, tar sands is more like a dirty sponge soaked in oil that takes way more energy spent on extraction and processing, which also means it's more expensive to produce. During this depletion phase, the costs of energy extraction and production increase, while the yields decline in a pattern of diminishing returns. Even if climate change wasn't a good enough reason to quit fossil fuels, reserves are being depleted rapidly, causing energy costs and ecological destruction to increase. One way or another, we'll need to learn to live without fossil fuel energy. For millions of years, living biology slowly harvested the sun's energy and stored it in these underground deposits of oil, coal, and natural gas, like a giant Earth battery. In the course of just a handful of human generations, we've used up most of this millions-year-old battery with no way to recharge it quickly. From a historical timescale, we're living in a very brief period of cheap energy. And of course, as energy demand continues to go up, as it's been doing for the past 100 years, and as energy supply declines, this will drive up the price of energy. As the cost to produce energy increases, the cost of all the things it makes possible will inevitably increase too over the next decades. That includes everything from housing to food to healthcare and more. So what about renewable energy? Can't we just transition to 100% renewable to continue our current way of life sustainably? Or nuclear energy? Or fusion? Well, the promise of these alternatives might be overhyped. The first challenge is that these renewable forms of energy mainly produce electricity. But it's very difficult to power things like airplanes, freight trains, cargo ships, and the giant blast furnaces producing cement and steel with electricity, at least affordably and at scale. 80% of our economy is built to burn oil, gas, or coal directly, not electricity. While some of these processes can be converted to run on electricity at a cost, many others will simply have to do without. Next, let's look at past progress towards a conversion to renewables. While absolute renewable energy production has increased greatly, so too has fossil fuel energy production. Over the past 20 years, the percentage of global primary energy supply from renewables has been essentially flat, while total energy consumption has increased by 40%. That means that renewables aren't truly replacing fossil fuel energy sources. They're just being added on top of the pile while we consume more and more energy. This pattern is called the Jevons paradox, and it also happens at the individual scale. When I was growing up, my family replaced our kitchen fridge with a newer, more efficient model. You would think this means that we consume less energy in total, but the old, inefficient fridge didn't go away. Instead, it went into the garage as a backup for beer and burgers. Jevons paradox states that usually, improvements in efficiency don't reduce overall consumption much, and instead often increase it. And so far, this has been true of global renewable energy production too. Not only that, but the idea that these energy sources are truly renewable and green misses a critical detail. All these alternative energy sources are built with non-renewable metals and rare earth minerals like cobalt, lithium, and copper. And most of these renewable generators only last 30 to 50 years, creating toxic byproducts at both ends of their life cycles. Currently, all mining depends on fossil fuels like diesel to power the large digging and hauling machines. In regions where resources for these technologies are being mined, there are already major human rights and environmental violations taking place. To go totally carbon neutral by 2050 would likely require a 500% increase in mineral extraction for the renewable energy transition. And in many cases, there might simply not be enough of certain minerals at a high enough concentration to make extraction worthwhile and economically viable. The simple fact is that non-renewable resources eventually become scarce and expensive, whether it's crude oil for your car or lithium for your car's battery. The issue of resource depletion and diminishing returns applies to the mining of uranium and thorium for nuclear power too, although the data on how long reserves would last varies widely. But considering the fact that nuclear disasters can leave a region uninhabitable for millennia, and considering the increasing risk of severe weather events due to climate change that our current infrastructure is not prepared for, plus geopolitical unrest and economic instability, how wise is it to become dependent on nuclear energy as we enter an uncertain and unstable future? Besides, splitting atoms is one hell of a way to boil some ramen noodles. Sure, a few wealthy countries might be able to pull off powering themselves with 100% renewables at current levels of consumption for perhaps a generation, possibly two, and we sure will feel really good about it and give each other awards and pats on the back. And if history's a guide, then most of the negative effects of these technologies, like toxic tailings ponds and waste dumps, will be outsourced to poorer nations, out of sight, out of mind. And in the end, we'll just run into the same problem of resource depletion again as with fossil fuels. These non-renewable resources run out and cause massive social and ecological destruction in the process. I'm not suggesting that we should just keep burning coal for energy. I think renewable forms of energy are needed at some scale, but it's important to consider the whole picture before racing to simply replace one energy source with another. Ideas like converting to 100% renewables might help address one crisis, climate change, while accelerating other ones like resource depletion, habitat loss, and environmental toxification. All of these problems are interconnected, so we need to take the time to look at the world with many different lenses, different worldviews, to figure out truly helpful solutions. And since I keep adding onto this big heaping pile of challenges, here's another one. All our infrastructure was built during this time of cheap, abundant energy, and built on an assumption that its supply was endless. That includes our industrial agriculture, poorly insulated buildings, as well as the settlement patterns of how our cities are divided into separate residential, business, and industrial districts, requiring daily long-distance commutes for many workers. Just rebuilding the energy infrastructure alone is in itself a hugely resource and energy-intensive undertaking, let alone housing, transportation, healthcare, and so on. So we can't afford to get it wrong again. It would be repeating the same mistake to go on and build enormous green energy megaprojects that require the continuation of the current highly complex and energy-intensive industrial systems in order to maintain. As we descend the curve of energy and resource depletion, those installations are likely to become stranded assets as the resources needed to maintain them become too expensive. The central problem of our energy consumption isn't so much how we produce our energy. The main problem is just the sheer volume we're consuming, and the trend that consumption is increasing, not decreasing. What's appropriate now is local, human-scale infrastructure with low energy input needs, low technological complexity, and high biological complexity and diversity. Not only does our infrastructure need a major overhaul, but so too do the stories that we tell about who we are, where we came from, and where we're going. You can think about cultures as having three different layers of structure. At the base, there's the material infrastructure that I've been talking about, which includes the sources of energy that fuel the society, as well as all the tools, machines, buildings, pipes, wires, and so on that sustain it. Then, operating on top of that are the explicit organizational structures like governmental institutions, corporations, laws, currencies, economies, and so on. Then there's the less visible but still important superstructure of cultural values, ideologies, narratives, and worldviews that provide a sense of identity and meaning. Modern society needs an almost complete transformation on all these levels of culture in order to properly adapt and respond to the converging crises we're facing. In the realm of narratives, the brief but rampant period of growth made possible by abundant cheap energy corresponds to a period of prosperity enjoyed in affluent nations like the US and Europe that created aspirational ideals like the American dream. But as we descend the energy curve, we can feel our standard of living eroding away and feel our dream of that future fading as well. Of course, the story is more complex. I'm painting with a broad brush here in the interest of time. I'll have to come back around later to paint in the happy little details. Like, there are also political and economic factors driving inequality, both within and between nations, which made this last 100 years a brief period of prosperity for some, but a period of disempowerment and exploitation for many others. In fact, those of us in overdeveloped nations have much to learn from those cultures who haven't been the main benefactors of this cheap energy glut. The average citizen of Costa Rica lives on about 1/6 the energy of the average North American, and yet they report similar levels of happiness and life satisfaction. And the pressures driving inequality are only likely to get worse in a future of increasing scarcity. So equity and justice need to be central in navigating the future with dignity and compassion. Our cultural narratives can also be manipulated for sinister purposes. After World War I, Germany was hit with crushing debt, which degraded the citizens' standard of living. The Nazi Party spun a narrative to blame the Jews for this felt decline, and we all know how that ended up. So be on watch for witch hunt type rhetoric that blames a specific outgroup for this felt decline due to the end of cheap energy. It's a global and inevitable process because the modern way of life depends on an absurd amount of energy and cannot possibly continue indefinitely. Times of scarcity also tend to breed more gambling and pyramid schemes. When future prosperity is not guaranteed, even despite any honest efforts, then people will often take greater risks for greater rewards. Speculative bubbles have become more common in the stock market, as we saw with the 2008 housing bubble crash. This trend is increasing the overall instability of global systems as we look ahead to the future. The end goal isn't that everyone in the world has access to the American middle class dream. There's not enough Earth to sustain that. To keep chasing that dream as it fades in view is leading to mass despair, anxiety, and burnout. We need to redefine what prosperity looks like. What does true progress mean? What is the good life? These are the questions we need to be asking right now. Instead of just obsessing over technological solutions like renewable or nuclear energy to try and maintain a fundamentally unsustainable and destructive way of life for an ever-shrinking percentage of the global population. These aren't just words and ideas that I'm throwing around here. These words, to the best of my ability, represent very probable realities that I think will be relevant to everyone in the years to come. That's my motive here, and I know this stuff is a lot to take in. So to bring it back down to our everyday life, we can use the tool of imagination to help us envision how our daily life would be affected in different energy depletion scenarios, like if gas was $30 per gallon, or if the electric grid was off intermittently, like it is in many third world countries. It's fun to try little experiments, like living for a week without a car, or turning all the power off in your house for a day, or chopping down a tree with an axe, especially when you try it with friends. It's like coming up with at-home adventures when you're bored, instead of hopping in a car or plane to go on an adventure. Part of creatively overcoming these obstacles will be discovering new ways to find enjoyment and meaning in life that aren't energy intensive. If you approach a new obstacle with a negative attitude because you're bummed you have to face the challenge, then your whole training session's gonna be a drag. But if you adopt a playful attitude and see the obstacle as a kind of puzzle to solve, then it can actually be fun. We're living in an insane period of human history that makes the future an even more slippery domain to try to predict and model than usual. But at least in the case of energy and resource consumption, we're so far outside the bounds of the geological limits that the Earth can sustain that it's a no-brainer to see that what goes up must come down. That's what the word unsustainable means. It means it can't sustain itself indefinitely. Whether we choose to accept this reality and adapt now, or wait till external events force it on us, one way or another, these unsustainable systems will come to an end. And sadly, most renewable energy technologies are not truly sustainable. What is truly sustainable? Biology, trees, plants, animals, fungi, soil. A truly sustainable society is one that can live within the biological energy and resource budget of its local land base, without exploiting and extracting from distant lands or distant generations. And I'm not suggesting that I've succeeded at this myself. I'm a big fat hypocrite. These are just some thoughts and questions I'm grappling with as I try to make sense of what this all means. So thanks again for taking the time to ask some of these tougher questions with me, even if we don't have any satisfactory answers, and have to just stew for a while in the uncertainty. Because I guess, as any chef knows, it takes time before the ingredients in a stew merge together into wonderful new flavors. Now I'm making myself hungry. I'll see you guys later.